All right, welcome everybody. Let me get my screen share set up and we'll get going here. So I'm excited to give this webinar. Thanks for joining me. This is all about resource guarding. And if you are taking resource guarding cases, we are going to get into some more advanced concepts as well. So kind of start off with the basics and then we'll move into some of the troubleshooting that can come in some of the more difficult types of cases, as well as I've got a few cases to show you later on. So kind of soup to nuts here as far as resource guarding is concerned. So first off, we want to define what resource guarding is, right? It's often a misunderstood label, and anybody that follows me on my presentations knows that I try to avoid labels or labeling the type of aggression or the type of aggression case. But resource guarding is a fairly universal term in our industry, at least when we start talking about this label of resource guarding, or what is a dog doing when they're resource guarding. And for me, I like to focus on behaviors, as many of you know, where we're focusing on the observable behaviors, things like barking, lunging, growling, snarling, snapping, biting, freezing, and the behavior is motivated to keep priority access to something of value to the dog. So whenever I'm talking with somebody about a resource guarding case, I try to define the behaviors that I'm seeing, as well as the components of the stimulus that's approaching. So the distance, the intensity, the duration of usually the person approaching or the other dog, in the environment that the dog that we're working with is focusing their aggression towards. So it's also a normal behavior. We do it too. If you remember, I've got this fun picture from the start of the pandemic, right? We resource guard items just as much as dogs do. It's a natural behavior, it's a normal behavior. And I think it's also important that when we're talking with our clients, that we educate them that this is very normal behavior. So it's if in fact, if we didn't resource guard or use those behaviors, we wouldn't survive long, because it's a normal survival trait or mechanism for animals to protect things that they need to survive. So for dogs, it's a very, very normal behavior. And when I'm talking to clients, I have to kind of help them understand that it may not be so offensive after all when their dog is displaying growling or something when they have something of value. Because many of our clients, they get upset that, how dare my dog get upset at me or growl at me when I'm the one providing all these good things and paying for their dog food and bones and new toys and all those things. But again, normal behavior. So the interesting thing about the definition too is that, I think I said many of us can universally agree on a general definition for resource guarding. But believe it or not, there's actually no universally agreed upon strict definition for it. But I do like these two definitions, especially the second one from Patricia McConnell, who's certainly somebody that knows a lot about resource guarding behaviors. And it's just basically behavior that discourages another to take or get too close to an object or valued area in a dog's possession. So resources can involve food, which we often think about when a dog is guarding a resource, but it can include toys, bones, resting spots, people, locations, priority access locations. So, that front doorway area, other animals in some cases. So there's lots of different resources a dog may display aggression around. Now, here's the digging a little deeper, thinking about the emotions in the resource guarding cases. When you think about aggression in dogs, we often want to look at the motivation or the underlying emotion. The reason why is, in order to properly address most of our aggression cases, we have to concentrate on helping the dog feel better about that threatening stimulus, right? So it's very, very important to concentrate on how the dog is feeling. So you can kind of compare and contrast this to maybe a case where a client calls you and their dog is jumping up on visitors that come over, or grandma comes over, and they're trying to prevent that dog from hurting grandma. But what's the dog's motivation in that case, or the underlying emotion? It's probably not going to be fear in most of your cases if the dog's, in a affiliative way, excited that grandma's coming over and jumping up. So oftentimes we're not so concerned about changing that underlying emotion, right? We don't necessarily say, oh, we've got to work on, sort of this underlying fear that the dog has. It's not to say some dogs can't be fearful of grandma coming over, but different type of case, right? So we're often not necessarily worried about changing emotions or associations, but aggression certainly is one that we're often focusing on the underlying emotion. So think in your mind, if a dog is guarding, question for you guys, I guess, is what do you think the emotion is that the dog is experiencing? And one of the common misconceptions, I think, with a resource guarding is that fear is attributed to the underlying emotion. Now, that can happen in some cases, but there was sort of this misnomer at one point where it was like it's fear of losing the resource, but it's kind of a strange way of stating fear, right? So when you think about fear, it's a dog that is feeling threatened by a particular stimulus or feels like there's a potential harm that's going to come to them. So there's safeties in play. But it's when you think about resources, though, think about a human analogy here. So if you're sitting down at your favorite restaurant and somebody comes over to you, some stranger, and just comes over and walks up to your plate and sticks their hand in your plate or maybe tries to pet you on top of your head while you're eating, or grabs you by the shirt and tries to move you away from your plate, what is your emotion going to be like? Is it going to be fear? Maybe at first, but then what's it going to turn into if that keeps happening over and over again? You can think about how angry you might get or how frustrated you might get. So generally in many resource guarding cases, you're going to see that it's not fear based. It's you're going to see different emotions in play, and we can suspect anger, or if you're looking at an effective neuroscience lens, we might argue that it's the rage aspect of emotions. So if you look at Jaak Panksepp's work, in effective neuroscience and basic emotions, we might argue that the rage component is happening. So, okay. So, just to recap on the types of resources a dog might guard: food, ingestibles, include bones, rawhides, bully sticks, those kind of things in the food category. Different slight changes in the approach, the behavior change approach, when you have dogs that are working on something like a bully stick or something that doesn't just get eaten very quickly. So the duration of your training sessions, how you might approach the dog, can vary depending on what the ingestible is. But we'll get more into that later on. Toys, certainly, very common one that dogs might guard. Objects can be things other than toys. It doesn't necessarily have to be like the dog's actual toys. It can be something. I've had some dogs guard, oddly enough, a toilet bowl. I suspect in that case that the dog had at some point been deprived of ample supplies of water, but objects can be something as strange as that. Stolen objects, I kind of separate that out because it's objects the dog might, like socks that the dog goes and grabs and takes them, and we don't want them to have them. So sort of those off limits type of objects, eyeglasses, cell phones that we don't want the dog to have. I mentioned locations, and that can be things like dog beds, person's bed. It can be the front door, where there's a lot of resources sometimes. And keep that in mind. A little side note on your cases. The front door area is often a very resource rich environment. So a lot of times people keep their leashes there or their treat bags or things that the dog associates with really fun times. So often and sometimes people are greeting the dog in that area, so it can be a very hot spot. Same thing like the kitchen area for many dogs. People cooking, feeding the dog, their treats, their food can often be stored in the kitchen. So keep in mind, locations can be based on the number of resources that may be available there. People can be resources as well. Oftentimes it's the owner. So, it could be the dog's just guarding their owner. And there's differences there also as well. Dogs might resource guard their owner, and some dogs might actually be truly protecting their owner. Those cases are much less common when a dog is truly protecting their owner, sort of like if we were purpose breeding for protection trained dogs, Belgian Malinois or Shepherds or something like that. That's different than resource guarding, where the dog is worried about losing access to their owner or whoever they're near, or maybe the person has treats, and that kind of resource guarding can occur. You have also have combo or generalized guarding, and what that is when a dog's guarding multiple things on this list, and that can get very difficult when it gets into the generalized guarding, where everything becomes a resource, and it may not even become noticeable to the client, where they may just be bending down to tie their shoes, and the dog thinks or perceives that as a threat to a potential resource. And even if there's no resources around, it's that stimulus of the person reaching that becomes predictive of potentially losing a resource. Because, and if I was to kind of put words into the dog's mouth, it's like, oh no, they're going to touch something or they're going to take that away from me, because every time they reach down, that's usually what that means. And so, generalized guarding, you might even have to work on the stimulus of somebody even just bending slightly over as your first steps in that case. And I mentioned body handling here. So, if you look at Jean Donaldson's book, Mine, she talks about comorbidity with body handling, meaning some dogs that resource guard objects also have issues with body handling. So, touching collars, any kind of petting or handling, or getting them to move from point A to point B using any kind of tactile pressure. That is, sometimes you see that happen with resource guarding at the same time. And I actually had a discussion with Jean uh, uh, just a few months ago for a recording of a podcast. And I asked her that question. I was like, well, why do you think that's happening? And she's like, I'm not sure. And I kind of surmised that it's a history of when the dog was younger and people grabbed the dog or touched the dog or pushed the dog away from a resource. So the dog may start to associate that, oh no, somebody's grabbing my collar. That means they're about to pull me away from the comfy bed or my bone or my toy or something like that. So I suspect that the dog starts to get weary of when people touch or grab or push the dog away from something. So keep that in mind in your cases as well, because you will want to actually ask about that. If you have a client that hires you for uh, my dog's growling when the kids try to get their toys back or something like that. Ask about, how does your dog do when it's being touched in general? If the kids touch the collar or pet the dog or try to walk by the dog, does the dog respond to that? Because it can be because of that history. All right. So, contributing factors here. Why do dogs guard? And there is the whole nature nurture topic that can come in. And some dogs are, again, it's natural behavior in dogs, but you may see a higher prevalence in some breeds as well as in some lines of dogs. Anybody who's worked enough golden retriever cases will have seen sometimes some very intense resource guarding with some lines of goldens. And then if you look at other dogs that we've, as humans, have selected for guarding behaviors, dogs that guard livestock, for instance, or people, or other objects, we've selected for more intense resource guarding. So heritability can be sometimes part of the package. Um, Stressors, so distant antecedents or setting events for resource guarding behaviors, we want to make sure we're considering. So always remember that when you're doing the history taking, also consider what might be adding more fuel to the fire, so to speak. So things like, if a dog's guarding their food, is there things happening that are making the dog more hungry? So is it the dog maybe has a medical issue increasing hunger, or new medication increasing hunger? Are there other stressors in the environment potentially making that dog's day more difficult? I'll give you an example. I had a client actually I was talking to yesterday. One of the main issues is separation anxiety, but the days that we're more likely to see resource guarding is when the dog has had moments of being separated from the owner. So that can add more fuel behind it. And the other thing, too, that we want to make sure our clients are aware of is not inadvertently adding value to the resources. So, a good example is when somebody has a young dog and the dog's stealing the kid's socks or there's something. And so maybe they've learned to, learn to trade for things. Wait, so the dog grabs socks, they get the socks back. But what happens when it's eyeglasses or maybe a bottle of pills or something dangerous? What do we do as humans? we rush over there and we're like, no, and then we grab the pills or, oh no, this is awful. And what does that do? The dog's like, huh, this must be really valuable because they're making such a big deal about it. And so it actually can make things worse based on the human's behavior. So it's something to coach our clients with. Perfectly normal response. You know, I never fault my clients for making a big deal about it. Of course, we're going to have a problem if our dog picks up a steak knife or something like that. But we want to be careful to manage those resources in the future, or those objects, I should say. Okay, so I'm going to the next slide here. Uh, so, what else can make it more likely? Obviously, the value of the items. So, you know, the difference between a bowl of kibble versus a bowl of liver or something for a dog. You guys know that. Same thing we think about all the time when we're using reinforcers. Motivating operations. So what is that? There's two factors of motivating operations. That's a term from applied behavior analysis where we're looking at what's really motivating the dog to display or make it more likely for that behavior to occur. And so the things like I was talking about, increasing hunger can be a motivating operation. That's an establishing operation where it's going to make it more likely to happen. And then you have abolishing operations, which is making it less likely. So if the dog's just eaten and maybe they've gotten a second bowl of kibble as a bonus, then that's an abolishing operation, makes it less likely to happen. Why is that important? Because we want to educate our clients to recognize those things, because they have to be good at modifying or understanding when to modify their behavior change approaches when we've given them instructions on a certain behavior plan. So if we're teaching them, for instance, very basic procedure for working around a dog that guards their food bowl, we want to be aware of, or make them aware of, when the dog's going to maybe need a little more distance, or maybe we want to keep that session a little shorter. So how to make those adjustments based on those motivating operations. I mentioned distant antecedents. Those are, again, factors that make it more likely, similar to motivating operations, but distant antecedents are factors in the environment in which it can increase the likelihood of the behavior. So those stressors, the construction next door, the dog just had a conflict with another dog at the dog park or something like that, that can add more stressors to the dog's day. It's important that we educate our clients on those factors as well, to keep in mind that not every day is going to be the same. So you don't get those "it happened out of the blue" kind of comments from your clients. It's much better if they can understand all the factors that can impact the likelihood. Medical issues are certainly something to pay attention to in your resource garden cases. Out of most of the types of aggression cases, medical issues are probably the least likely in resource guarding, with the exceptions of, again, food type of resource guarding behaviors. Of course, let's say the dog's on steroids or something like that for a particular medical issue that might increase hunger. You have some meds that can increase thirst. You have some meds that, of course, can decrease hunger. So all of those can, in fact, impact the dog's potential to guard. Things like diabetes, and maybe the dog's only being fed in the morning and they get really hangry in the afternoon or evening. That might impact things. So it is good to look at and work with a veterinarian with ruling out any kind of underlying medical issues. But most of the time, let's say it's a dog guarding toys, I may not necessarily be reaching for medical. The other side note for that is dogs that might be guarding beds or couches or things like that, that you also want to look at medical, because the dog might be in pain or have some underlying condition which they just want to stay on that comfy resting spot and not be bothered. So when the kids come over and try to move the dog off the bed, the dog could be in pain, and that could be fueling the behavior as well. And I mentioned what the people or other animals do. So we're going to be looking a lot at the intensity of a stimulus. So with all of your aggression cases, you want to be paying attention to the intensity, and that's what the person or other animal is doing. So if a person is walking very quickly or running towards that food bowl while the dog's eating and they're waving their hands and making a lot of noise, that's much more intense than if they're just walking by slowly and not making eye contact at a distance. And those are important variables to control in your guarding cases. Okay. I'm just going to double check the time, see how we're doing. Okay, making good time. Um, so, common misconceptions, you're going to get these from your clients as well. There's often many questions because the thing about resource guarding is that there's tons of information online, and a lot of clients will go and be searching about how to help their dog at first. And as you guys know, there's good information and not so good information when you do a Google search on aggression, and especially with resource guarding. So you sometimes will come into cases where the clients made it much worse or more difficult for themselves because of that advice. And we have to be empathetic to that. And, we can't blame the client for simply just trying to do what's best for their dog in their situation with the information they have. And so, but out of most of your aggression cases, this is the type of case that you're often going to see maybe something clients doing to make it worse or actually creating the issue. So, just giving him a million toys, or, let's say you have a dog that guards tennis balls, and the question would be like, what if I just put out 100 tennis balls? That means he's got tons. But if the analogy I use for clients to understand that is, what if they're guarding, or what if it's you at home and somebody comes in and drops $100 bill, or a high value note on the ground? What if you have hundreds of $100 bills? That means, are you going to guard them less? Probably not. You're probably going to guard them more because there's more of them. So that particular concept can work sometimes, but oftentimes it can backfire. Spoiling them too much. I'm in the thought process of, you really can't spoil a dog too much. I mean, I don't think they understand that concept anyways, but again, giving too many resources is something the clients are really worried about. But if that's the case, why, think about the dogs that we train all the time with tons of reinforcers. It doesn't have a bearing on the resource guarding behavior. They think the behavior is not normal. They think it can be really upsetting for them, for their dog to growl or snap at them if they're, trying to just take back something they just gave them, or they're paying for it, bringing it home from the store. So it's, again, we have to explain that it's very normal behavior, and it's very contextual as well. And then the whole dominant, dog thing, where they're like, oh, I'm not being alpha enough. And so they think of all of these ways of trying to navigate that relationship with their dog. And, all right, should I be more alpha? Should I be more dominant? Do I need to punish my dog, or yell at my dog, or pin my dog on their back if they have something and they growl at me? And of course, as you'd all know, that can make things much worse because you're just bringing more confrontation into a already confrontational situation. Okay, so as we're getting into the assessment aspect of this, do we want to make sure we're determining, is it really resource guarding? Because the cases that you want to be very careful about when we are giving a behavior change strategy are resource guarding cases, because if we assess it incorrectly, we might give an incorrect behavior change strategy. So I do spend a lot of time with clients going over the assessment aspect of making sure I know what's going on, because some of them can be very similar. Some of these behaviors may present very similar. So if you see this dog here, the question for you guys is, what is the dog doing? So I'll give you a little precursor here. The dog on the ground here is a little puppy, kind of just barking at this Doberman here. But what's the reason for that dog's behavior? So we know that the antecedent is this dog approaching, but what's the motivation? Why is this dog showing that face to this puppy on the ground? And so is it guarding this little eggplant toy? Is it guarding the couch? Is it just doesn't like puppies? Is it fearful of puppies? Who knows what the issue is? So that's why good history taking will start to unveil that. So let me play this video for you here. Oh, quick side note, if you have a dog nearby, or your own dog, just turn down the volume a little bit, because this dog is growling and sometimes that can set your dogs off. So you might want to adjust your volume for just a moment here. So again, without further history taken, we may not know. So what I would ask the client is, what does your dog do when it's just with the eggplant toy and there's no couch involved? What does your dog do when there's no or I should rephrase that. What does your dog do when it just has the toy and there's no couch? Or what does your dog do when there's no toy and it's on the couch? How does your dog do with your puppy when the couch and toy are not there? And that'll start to give you the information you're looking for in terms of what the dog is guarding and if the dog is guarding at all. All right, so I've got a few fun videos here as well on resource competition type of behaviors. So most of your cases, the dog's going to already have possession of the resource. So they're already going to have that toy or that bone closer to them, and their perception is that it's in their possession at that time. There are some cases though, and that's why 9.99 out of every 10 cases is going to be the dog's in possession of it. But there are a small percentage where the dog doesn't have possession of it, and they're going to compete over access to that resource. And so you often see the communication between dogs and for access to that resource. So I'll play some of these videos for you where some of these dogs are kind of showing different behaviors over competition over a resource.
Yeah, kızım bak. Gel.
Such a great video of the subtle communications and really beautiful communication between those two dogs competing over that resource, that kibble on the ground. Here's another good one that might indicate some jealousy in between two dogs.
망고 힐을 준다? 망고. 힐을 준다? 힐을 준다?
Here's another fun video. Maybe not so subtle communication or intricate communication as we saw in the first video on those last two dogs. But as you can see, some dogs will use aggression or use signals to gain access to a resource. And just as a side note on that too, you want to make sure that if you're working with a client's dog, there are a very rare few dogs, but you do want to be aware of this, that will see the treat pouch on you. They know you've been working with them. And as you try to move away or end the session, they may get frustrated or they may say, I still want that resource, and you're not leaving with it. And they will use aggression to try to gain access to that. So just be careful when you're using food with your resource guarding cases, or if there's a history of competition or the dog using aggression to gain access to a resource, make sure you have some layers of safety or protected contact in place when you're working with those cases. All right, let's get into the body language now. So The air quotes here, if you can see. I mean, nice thing about resource guarding cases is that the body language is often very similar. So you're going to see many of the same types of body language. So once you start seeing it, it's you're going to see the same type of signals all the time: the freezing, the growling, the whale eye, the lowering of the head, maybe faster eating, and things like that. So let me show you some videos here that demonstrate some of the guarding behaviors. But what I want you to also look for is if you're assessing underlying emotion here, do you see fear-based body language, or do you see more or something different?
And can I have the bone? And can I have the bone, please? Look.
All right. And you can see also that dog is displaying what's called an agonistic pucker on the commissures of the lips move into that C shape. So compare and contrast that to a dog that's fearful or displaying fear-based behaviors. You often see the lips moving in the complete opposite direction. So you see lip retraction, a very long lip for a dog that's fearful. So we can, again, argue about the underlying emotions, and we can argue a way that it's not fear-based in most of your resource guarding cases. Here's another video that, again, social media is great for educational purposes on these aggression videos, but of course, obviously, I don't recommend what you're going to see in the next video.
در باز کن برو تو ماشین
بیا دوا بفرست.
در باز کن
مثلا ما گذاشت میگی
حالا هرچی هم میگی در باز کن در ماشین باز کن از بغل برو تو آفرین کامل برو تو باز دیگه حالا برو تو بپر تو درم بگی ببر هیچ کی نذاری به تو ماشین هر کی
All right, that video was supposed to play the last, so not that I would recommend that for most people, but it's not something I would be totally against if they're purpose breeding or asking for the dog to do that. But this video is what I was talking about.
You did. You gon' die. You gon' die. You gon' die.
All right, so as far as body language, again, we're seeing agonistic puckers, we're seeing snarling, we're seeing lowered head, we're seeing freezing, whale eye. And so, again, classic body language. We can also ask our clients not to video this, of course, but to describe the behavior in the body language if we want to get further details about it being resource guarding. Okay, so now let's keep you guys safe, making sure that we've got the right setups in play when you're working with your clients or if you're instructing the clients to do things. So obviously with all of your aggression cases, or really any behavior case you're going to take, you want to prevent rehearsal of the behavior. So we want the dog not inadvertently getting reinforced for guarding behaviors. Sometimes it's very easy. So you can go in with a dog that guards their food bowl and just simply say, make sure you're feeding the dog in a separate room. And I've had cases where literally they didn't think of that, and that's all they needed to do to fix the problem. So sometimes management's very easy. Sometimes it's very difficult. So you might go into a home where there's tons of stuff, and we'll talk about what to do in those cases in just a moment. So safety setups, I'm going to talk more about that in just a moment. I'm going to show you some of the equipment I use as well. But they're going to differ for your dog to human and dog to dog cases, obviously. With humans, most of the time, we can just tell them, don't approach the dog while it's eating. Don't touch the dog's toys while it has them. Those kind of instructions can be used for management. With dog to dog resource guarding, though, it gets a little trickier, obviously, because we can't always say, hey, don't go over to your housemate when they're chewing a bone, because obviously a lot of times the other dog's like, I really want that bone. So management scenarios are going to be a little bit different, generally more difficult, of course, in your dog-dog aggression cases, and more so if you have a multi-dog home, which is sometimes the case, as we know. All right, so here's one setup I've been using in my cases. This is what we call a back tie. You can see that there's a long line attached to the dog's collar or harness. I tend to prefer a harness. This particular case, that we didn't have a harness available at the time, but you don't want the dog, of course, charging against a long line on a flat collar. So rear clip harness is the ideal setup. But I've got just a long line attached to the back of this door here. And you shut the door on the leash, of course, and that kind of serves as a very sturdy back tie. And what this does is it prevents the dog from leaving the resource to come and bite the owner or you as the person working with the dog. You don't have to do this in every case, but there are some dogs that will leave the resource. Most of the time, they're going to just bite once you get close enough to the resource. But some dogs will say, "All right, I'm going to leave this food here for a second. I'm going to charge across the room, bite that person, and come back to my food ball." And that was actually the case with this dog. This dog, Riley, had landed 2 very severe bite incidents on the male owner in the home. And because of all of the things they were trying to do incorrectly that they learned online, unfortunately, to the point of making the resource guarding very, very intense. So this prevents the dog from actually getting to that person. And of course, when you want to remove the tether, fortunately, this door leads to a garage. You just go into the garage and you recall the dog towards you into the garage area, so you're not approaching the resource from this way to unclip the leash or anything like that when you're done with the session. Obviously, you can't use muzzles in a lot of your resource guarding cases for safety, because if it's a food-based resource guarding case, it can be very tricky with a muzzle on. So you need some other layers of protected contact or safety in place. So tethers can also be used. Be careful with shorter tethers, because let's say we are working with a dog that guards a bed or something like that, and we're just, again, keeping the dog attached to something so they can't physically leave the resource to bite the person. You obviously need to get that resource away at some point or end the session. So a short tether may not do the trick. But for your dog-to-dog guarding cases in the home, and the dog's not directing any aggression towards the human who's going to come over and unhook the tether at some point, these can be great for your intra-household dog-dog aggression cases. So the very important aspect of this is to make sure you are not the dog's not barking and lunging and hitting the end of the line. That would be the improper use of a tether. Tethers are just so the dog can't say, "All right, I'm going to get up and now move over to the other dog while they're chewing on their bone," or something like that. So, and we'll get into the behavior change aspects of dog-to-dog resource guarding as well. Camila, if you can just clarify what you mean by like what, please. Maybe you're talking about the safety setups. Exercise pens also can be very useful. So 2 ways you can use this. Okay, excellent. So we're getting into the safety aspects here to answer Camila's question. Exercise pens are great for this because 2 things you can do. You can have the dog inside the exercise pen, or you can put yourself inside the exercise pen if you need a layer of protected contact. So let's say it was that dog Riley and we're working on her food bowl. She can have freedom of movement and move around, but if we're worried about her moving towards us, we can be inside the exercise pen, or vice versa. We can work with the dog with, let's say, chewing on a bone or a toy, or they have their toy and we're doing counter conditioning for our approaches. They can be inside the exercise pen. But again, another way of not having to use a muzzle, or maybe you don't want to use the back tie for any particular reason, you can use this setup. For dog-to-dog aggression cases, you can even put a crate inside here, or the crate. I'm sure you've seen the crate door setups where you put one exercise pen side on one side and the other on the other, and you attach and kind of create this large space. Great for intra-household dog-dog aggression cases. Just be aware of the resource. The dog may start to resource guard that particular location if all the goodies are happening in there. So for your intra-household dog-dog cases, or even your dog-to-human aggression cases, just make sure everybody's aware of that, because if we increase the value, that can be okay. We can make that an off-limits area or work on the guarding of that area. But just make sure your clients and you keep an eye on that, because sometimes you see a guarding of a new location, which we obviously don't want. Baby gates also, for your intra-household dog aggression cases is great, but also keeping the dog in a space away from resources. Now, I'm sure most of you know how to use a baby gate, or in your behavior cases, I'm sure I've seen this. But the caveat for me for intra-household dog aggression cases is to make sure there's two gates in between the dogs. What I find is that if the dog's got a resource on one side and the other dog sort of approaches the gate, that one layer or one gate is not enough to prevent communication or barrier frustration or aggression issues. So sometimes when dogs go nose to nose at a gate or a fence, you get the barrier frustration or aggression components that can come into play, and that can make things much more difficult if you're not careful. All right, what about hand protection? If you don't own a pair of bite gloves or some minimal hand protection in your working aggression cases, I highly recommend going out and getting yourself a pair. You can get these. Let's see, most of you are on the UK, so I'm not sure if Aces ships out there, but I'd be actually curious. Maybe somebody can pop into the chat box where you buy your safety gear from. So Kevlar gloves or things like that. I wonder if you have like an ACES, or it's Animal Care Equipment and Supplies is the company that sells most of these things in the U.S. I'm not sure if they ship to the U.K., but I'm sure you can find a good pair of Kevlar lined, even motorcycle riding gloves on Amazon or any kind of local type of safety gear kind of company. Workers' gloves, that kind of thing. But the key aspect you're looking for is that Kevlar, because that's similar to what they make bulletproof vests with, and it's puncture proof, puncture resistant for the most part. The reason why I do this is obviously with many of our resource guarding cases, we're eventually going to be getting closer to the dog. So it's different than like a leash reactivity case or a stranger danger case where we might not be getting close to somebody or another animal. With resource guarding, we're often eventually getting closer or close enough to the dog where we want to protect our hands. So in your risky cases, your high bite cases, I recommend using hand protection. And for your clients, we might even recommend hand protection for them if they're concerned about the dog's bites. Even if we set things up safely, we give them a beautiful behavior change strategy, we make sure that nothing can happen. It can often help them feel more confident with the actual training strategy. So what that may look like is sometimes they can be very hesitant, or they may be saying, I'm not going to do this at all because they're worried about the bite. The hand protection can kind of give them an additional sort of layer of confidence in addition to safety. Obviously, you want to get the dog used to seeing this on your hands. So I recommend just doing basic training or walking around the house, doing your typical chores or whatever with your gloves on, and then the dog gets used to seeing those on you. I talked about muzzles, but again, muzzles cannot be very useful for many of these cases because we're often using food. We're often tossing food to the dog. The dog can't practice chewing on a bone or a toy or eating their own kibble. So most of the time, I'm not going to use a muzzle in resource guarding of objects or location type cases. Resource guarding of people, I might employ those. Unless the dog's very good at getting treats or things off the floor, which you can teach with some dogs. You teach them how to lick like peanut butter out of a ball through their muzzle. And so then you put more like treats in there. So you teach them how to kind of put their head down. And a lot of dogs have a real difficult time trying to figure that out at first. But you can teach some dogs to eat through muzzles, but it sometimes can make it more difficult for you in your cases when you can do other layers of protected contact. Here's a setup that I was talking about with the crate inside the X pen. This is a resource guarding French bulldog case where all three dogs had issues with each other. This was a very tricky case, but you can see the safety setups, tethers, and so multiple layers of safety. And this short video just shows some of the initial strategies of classical counter conditioning as well as differential reinforcement, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's going to be helpful just because it's when you're practicing for the initial few times, if they're directly staring at each other, that's what triggers it. So you want to these close quarter interactions, it's easier to set it up for success this way.
Good.
So make sure, again, you can see that the dogs wouldn't be able to go nose to nose at that gate during those initial sessions. Even if they're supervised, we want to be careful that they don't go right up to each other at that initial stage. And we'll talk more about the behavior change strategies in a moment. Going to be helpful. All right. Next thing, as far as safety, since we're still talking about safety, is how to pick up objects. This is, I'm sure many of you are doing this, but this is something you really want to coach your clients on, because you can go in and tell them all about this beautiful resource guarding strategy you just learned, or you're going to give them, and then they're working with their dog, and the dog's doing beautifully. But then they end the session, they're trying to pick up that toy that they were just working on, and the dog was beautifully responding to. But suddenly, you're now reaching down to pick up that toy. How do we do that safely? It's very simple. You just make sure that we get the dog away from the resource through creative placement of reinforcers. So we're tossing the treats away from that resource so we can pick up that object. So this dog has an issue guarding this stuffed porcupine toy. And so all I want to do is make sure I'm getting them on the other side of the room.
Good job, Ryan. Good job. Yes, good job. Very nice. Very nice. Good job. So how do you put that away now? Yeah, put it off.
Yes.
Just so it's out there.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
And sometimes when I end the session with a resource guarding case, I want to kind of take their mind off the object. So I'll engage them a couple other behaviors, sits, whatever the dog knows, just to continue having fun in that session, producing reinforcers. I find that's helpful so the dog doesn't get in that mindset of, uh-oh, session's ending, that means I'm about to lose my resource. So we don't want to create that pattern that can become problematic later. Let's see. All right, some additional ancillary things that I'm sure many of you guys know about. I talked about Gene Donaldson's Mind. It's sort of like the Bible of resource guarding, right? If I recommend it to my clients, I recommend it to trainers. It is got tons of good behavior blueprints on resource guarding, and most clients can kind of read and digest that. It is a little bit, and Gene admits it, as far as a little bit too recipe-like for some people to follow. So I do like to make clients aware that you can skip some rungs in those steps, or you can modify things based on what you're seeing. And I coach them on what aspects to look at, like changes in body language or emotional responses. We can modify what's seen in the step-by-step process. I also do not like to reinvent the wheel. So if there's a good video online about teaching Leave It, I like Kiko Pup's Leave It. That's a very important strategy. Now, here's the thing. This is so top of mind for me and fresh in my mind because I just had a case like this where the advice given is nowadays, which is great advice, is to, when a dog like steals socks or something and a puppy, what do we want to do, right? How do we work with that? Well, we teach the dog or teach the puppy to bring it to us, and we exchange it for a treat. So the dog doesn't learn to guard. They start to kind of have a more positive association with giving up their socks they just took. But what can happen is, of course, is it reinforces that behavior of bringing socks, so the dog becomes a very good retriever, which is not a bad thing. I'll still take that all day long over biting or injuring somebody or developing resource guarding behaviors. However, what isn't being taught enough is how to get the dog to leave those things alone in the first place. So Kiko Pup's Leave It is, okay, I don't have to cue you to say, I don't want to have to say, leave it, because you're going to have to be there to say, leave it all the time. So what we want to do is actually teach the dog not to touch the resource or that object ever. If it's socks or eyeglasses or something like that, you can teach the dog, okay, it'll still pay off for you, but you don't have to bring it to me. Just look at it and leave it alone, and I'll reinforce you for that. But I'm not going to cue you to do that. I need you to make that decision on your own. So the object becomes the environmental cue, so to speak. But that's a very important aspect. We got to teach not only retrieve it, but drop it and leave it. So all of those skills should be taught, not just the retrieve it. And then if you're looking for a really great resource for dropping items, so let's say the dog does get those socks or those eyeglasses and we want them to drop it, Chirag Patel's, you can find it on his YouTube channel, Domesticated Manners. He teaches it through classical conditioning, which is a brilliant way of teaching drop it. It's by far the best way I've seen a drop taught. So check that out and also send it to your clients. All right. So next, let's get into the behavior change principles here. We want to, the question I get is it operant? Do we use operant conditioning? Do you use classical conditioning for this? And the answer is usually both, but it depends on the type of case. If the dog's been rehearsing it for quite some time, so let's say you've got a case where you've got a couple of years of resource guarding history of the food ball, and it's sort of become almost like an automatic response. I do a little bit more operant conditioning in those cases, like calling the dog's name, see if I can get like a behavior like the dog lifting its head out of the bowl and marking and reinforcing that. If it's not such a long-standing rehearsal of behavior, I will go with more classical conditioning, and what that looks like is, the typical: I'm going to approach the food bowl. I'm going to toss a higher value item in near the food ball or into the food ball if I can. Regardless of the behavior. And what we're going to look for is a change in the emotional response through the monitoring their body language. So the dog gets a little bit more tail wagging or does lift their head up out of the food bowl. We start to see behaviors indicating the dogs were changing that underlying association. And then autonomy, that is, allowing the dog to kind of make their own decisions in these processes. We want to make sure that we're not doing a lot of cueing of behavior, because if we add in too many cues, things like, hey, Fido, what are you doing over there? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing in some of your cases. It may just backfire in the long run, because then everybody has to initially add those cues. We want the environmental cue to be the person or the other dog approaching when the dog has a resource. Okay, fun video on what classical conditioning looks like. And this is great when you can kind of talk about with clients or finding these examples of what it looks like. And this is why we want to use classical conditioning with resource guarding.
What's a command you unintentionally taught your dog?
Great example of classical conditioning. That's exactly how we want the dog to respond when they see a person approaching the food bowl or another dog coming into the room while they're chewing on a bone. We want it to be a very powerful response that says something good's about to happen when you hear that noise. Here's a good example of a case where it can be very straightforward sometimes. So this is a case where a trainer in Mexico, when I was giving a seminar at a conference there, came up to me and asked me about how to deal with the dogs that he's working with. He's a police dog caretaker, but also a trainer. So he handles the dogs that the police force uses. So keep that in mind as you're watching this video. The dog's in a kennel, sort of the typical police kennel environment there. But this dog had severely injured this guy, this poor trainer. He had big bite wounds on his arm and his face. Just trying to get the food bowl out of here, empty or full. He could not get the food bowl out of here without this dog trying to attack him. So he had to go in, like, kind of being really careful, wearing protective gear many times. And so I said, let's work on a classical conditioning strategy. You're just going to keep approaching that dog's kennel area when the dog's eating or when it's near the food bowl, and you're going to be tossing higher value treats into the back of the kennel. And so he sent me this great video a few weeks after I met with him, just for 5 minutes, a 5-minute conversation I had with this guy about how to help this issue.
That Michael teach me. I want to take off the bow, and this dog show aggression. I will give him a treat because he go away from the door. Come on. Come on. Get it. Yeah, good boy. Good boy. And I of course it's easy to me is take the empty bowl.
So great, outcome there. Of course, it's not always that easy, and we'll get into the more difficult cases. I'm going to get into the typical behavior plans as well for each type of the cases because there's subtle differences, as I mentioned earlier, in these types of and the different types of cases that you're going to get for resource guarding. So let's jump into those in the next few slides here. Um, when you're looking at the actual behavior change plan, these are the 5 variables you're going to look at. So depending on if it's guarding the food bowl or guarding a couch, you're always thinking about these 5 keys, which is the distance. So obviously the distance at which the person's approaching from. Very, very important to note that because with resource guarding, it's going to get more micro, meaning you have maybe just 10 feet away, or in your case, couple 3 meters away, and it might be you might start at 3.5 meters or 4 meters. So it's different than like a leash reactivity case where you might say, okay, 30 meters or 50 meters or something like that. The intensity I mentioned is what the person or other animal's doing. We've got to pay attention to that because just even the angle of our approach can be more intense. So we have a straightforward approach versus I'm going to make more of a circular pattern around the dog can vary the intensity, even if you're at the same distance. The variation means you can work with a dog who guards their food bowl in one location and do it over and over and over, and dogs can be like, this is great in this location. You want to make sure that you're varying the training scenario. So generalizing as you do in most of your training plans. Value of the reinforcer we're using. We want to use something that's higher value than what the dog has. Now, what do you have? What do you do if a dog has something that's already very high value? Well, that's our job as creative trainers is to find those objects or those items that are higher value. So classic examples like a dog that's eating a raw diet, and you're probably like, ooh, raw diet. I mean, what gets more higher value than like, all of these chicken livers and hearts and all these real food items and things that can come into the picture? Well, you have to as a trainer determine what that dog finds of higher value. So preference tests, figuring out what does the dog like to eat the most out of that raw diet, and then using that perhaps to reinforce the dog. You might add in other reinforcers like attention from the owner or a novelty of a new object. You get these really high value treats and a new toy or something like that. You get to play with the owner. So you can do other things to add more value than what the dog has in most of your cases. Or you want to start with a lower value item. So you might start that dog off with just the sort of the least likely item in that raw diet that they're going to eat. And then you use higher value part of that meal to work with the dog. Of course, we also, with all behaviors, want to maintain our work with the dog. And so that means periodically still reinforcing, still walking by that dog while they're eating, tossing something high value once every couple weeks, even once we've seen that positive change. Because like all other behaviors, we need to maintain it, and as well as classical conditioning, we need to maintain that association over time. All right, what if they have this kind of situation? So multi-dog, tons of people. What are we going to do in those cases? And that's our job as creative trainers and consultants is to assess what's most important for that client. And because here's the nice thing about resource guarding. The behavior change strategies are often very similar. You're going to go into a house, 2 different clients, they may have resource guarding, like, all right, it's the same thing, same plan over and over and over. And that's kind of the nice thing. It responds usually pretty well to one type of typical behavior change strategy. But what about the environments? You could take the same dog and put them in 2 different homes. You're going to get 2 totally different cases much of the time. So make sure that one of the initial things to discuss with your clients is discussing overall goals and expectations. And then what's most important for the environment. Let's say if you have a dog in a home with this many family members, you get you want to kind of ask, what's most important for you in this situation? You have lots of children. Maybe it's managing of toys, or maybe it's working on toys or something like that versus the food bowl, because we know we can feed the dog in one little small nook of the house that no kids are allowed in. So do triage what's most important for that client. Next thing, I talked about value, but sometimes a sort of a more advanced concept here is that the value may change depending on the dog's day. So I'm sure you guys have seen this where you've used one type of treat a lot and suddenly it starts to lose its value for that dog. That can often be the novelty of it because if I was to give you some U.S. currency here, would it be more valuable to have $100 bills? So I give you a stack of $100 bills, and you at first, if you didn't see the number on the top, and I threw a bundle of bills at you, you're like, "Wow, that's great!" Or threw it all in the air at you, great. Or would you prefer a $100 bill? That's the same monetary value, but it may mean different to you. Or what if I gave you $100 in quarters? A big bag of coins. Was that more valuable to you? And it's going to differ depending on the person you're talking to a lot of times. So, same thing for dogs. Keep that in mind when you're dealing with your reinforcers. It may change as well. So, you have to keep in mind that with your clients, you may need to refresh what you're using for reinforcers for that particular case. Most of the time, you're going to be able to use the same thing, but I did want to put that out there that sometimes you have to change the reinforcer you're using in these resource guarding cases because that reinforcer the dog essentially could be like, this is great, but I get hot dogs now every day, so they're just okay, right? When it's the first time or that novelty, they may be like, wow, this is great. Okay, how do we know when it's working? We are looking at body language again. So we want the opposite of the freezing, the head lowering, the stiffness, the agonistic puckers. We want the head leaving the resource. We want soft eyes, relaxed body language. So here's a good video of a German Shepherd that used to guard this raw hides, and the owner's working with the dog here, and you can see the body language we're looking for.
Hi, Fran.
Yeah, good job.
So relaxed, open mouth, soft eyes, interest in the owner, leaving the resource. All of those are signs that we're making progress with that particular type of approach. Just a little background on that case. The owner just doing walk-bys while the dog's got the rawhide. Dog notices that, and then the high-value treat, I think they were using chicken in this case, comes flying, and then you just rinse and repeat that. Very straightforward resource guarding plan. Here's another case. This dog, Oliver, I worked with that has issues guarding couches, toys, and people. So the person behind the camera is filming, but you're going to see the dog leave all of these resources or sort of move away when the other owner who this dog was guarding against, comes out of the hallway area. So tail wagging, leaving the resources, sort of this anticipation, like, what do you got for me? And then that's when you know that your work is paying off, because you'll notice in this case that nobody's saying, "Hey, what are you doing?" or "Hey, I'm trying to get the dog's attention." It's the approach of the person that's the environmental stimulus that sets that behavior in motion. Okay, let's talk about some more advanced concepts here. So if you are doing a lot of resource guarding cases, you'll want to be aware of these factors as well. These are some of the more common kind of sticking points I see in many trainers' cases, and sometimes I get a lot of questions about, all right, Mike, I got this case, but we're getting stuck or something's not working. So it's very important for any classical conditioning strategy, you want to make sure that we're going in the right order of events. So what that means is that we want to always make sure that the appetitive or nice thing happens after the dog notices the provocative stimulus or the currently bad thing in their minds. We want them to understand that this good thing happens only after you've noticed that bad thing. So the reason why is we want to turn that bad thing into a good thing because we're pairing it with that good thing after. So if you do it in the opposite order, what can happen is it can make it much worse, right? So if the dog, we give the dog some food and then like we approach the food ball, right? And we drop some food down and then we pet the dog or pick up the food ball or do something like that. What's the dog going to learn? The dog's quickly going to learn that, okay, the food that you're dropping down predicts this bad thing's about to happen. So you're about to pet me or you're about to take away my food ball when you drop those hot dogs down. And pretty soon, dogs be like, I don't want you coming anywhere near me with hot dogs because that means you're going to do those icky things. So be very careful because it can be subtle too sometimes. You know, you see it sometimes, for instance, your stranger danger cases for dogs that have issues with strangers coming in the home. Somebody starts chopping up hot dogs and getting ready for that training scenario because they're all excited. They're like, this is great. We're going to work on scary Uncle Bob coming over and getting our dog, used to Uncle Bob because we're going to give hot dogs after the dog sees Uncle Bob. But that cutting up of hot dogs can start to predict Uncle Bob's about to come over. So you want to be very careful in those moments too, where anything that you're doing with the food or the treats starts to predict that negative event. It should always be the dog sees the negative thing, then the positive thing happens, or that appetitive stimulus happens. A blocking effect. What is that? It's when the dog latches onto some other stimulus in the environment as the safety signal, in a sense. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're working with a very good, consistent owner. They've always got their treats. They've got their chicken in their treat pouch. They've been working with their dog and everything's going great. So the dog is not guarding the food ball. They get very excited. They see the owner coming over and they're responding beautifully. But then you try to do some cold trials, or the owner's walking around another day, and suddenly the dog's like, barks, growls, and does the behavior. And you're probably like, what is going on? I don't get it. It looks so great. It's been looking great. The reason why is the dog latches on to something like the treat pouch being on that owner. So now the dog's like, okay, this is cool, and you're safe, but it's only when you have that treat pouch on. And so, or the hot dogs in your hand, or you've chopped up hot dogs. So you want to make sure that when you're doing your setups, that the dog isn't just picking up on one potential aspect of that. Treat pouches are a big one. Sometimes the dog sees that and it's like, okay, we're cool when you have that treat pouch on, but any other time I know you're not going to have treats. So try to keep it random. You can have your treats in stations. You can mix and match the treat pouch. You can have the treat pouch on the client on other days when they're not doing that training, so it doesn't become part of just that particular context. Here's one where this is the difficulty in many of your cases, of course. But with resource guarding especially, again, our job as good trainers and consultants is to make sure we are setting the stage first. So when we're doing our setups, we want to do some testing to see what's going to be best for that dog and evaluate reinforcers, but also evaluate the setup or the environment. If we don't give the clients the tools to learn how to do a setup, so teach them about those 5 keys to success, the intensity, the duration of the session, all those things, we're going to set them up for failure because they're going to often try to push things too quickly, as clients like to do. So it's important to give them a pretty structured plan on what you think as the consultant is going to work, and making sure that it's not too difficult for the dog. So, the distance, the what the client's using, what the intensity of the client's doing, because they need to be coached a lot on that too. So intensity for like reaching, so if you could see my hand reaching towards the camera right now, that's not too intense, but a client may think, okay, this is not too intense, right? And so they need to be coached to those little micro details, because again, the behavior change strategy is not that different. It's the little details. The crumbs. What are the crumbs? That's a very scientifically named term for things that get crumbly, like treats. So it's something, again, you learn through experience, but if you remember those old Natural Balance food rolls, I don't know if you had them necessarily in the UK, but Natural Balance makes these like food rolls, so like Happy Howies, or you chop them into bits. But then they had a manufacturing change, and then their food got really crumbly. And I noticed that in some of the resource guarding cases, the dog would start to guard that area or maybe be less likely to respond. The reason why is because those treats, when you're tossing them, they start to leave little crumbs. And so in a sense, you're leaving more resources and more resources and more resources. The same thing can happen with like shredded chicken or spray cheese or peanut butter, or things that can still have remnants of that particular item. Dog may start to guard that. So make sure you're using treats or food that's very easy for the dog to ingest, and then it's almost basically completely gone. And last but not least is the warm-up factor. sometimes, again, the clients during the training sessions, everything's looking great, and then suddenly it's not. And so they report, okay, we did 5 sessions, everything was great, but on the sixth one, I came in the room and the dog exploded at me. I don't get it because we picked up on the same step we left off yesterday. And what happens usually is the dog's not warmed up into training. So meaning usually during a resource guarding session with, like, for instance, a food ball, the dog is eating, and that first few seconds can be very intense because the dog just had their food ball put down, and the client tries to rinse and repeat what they did yesterday, maybe 5 feet away from the food ball, and the dog explodes at them. It's because they haven't been warmed up yet. They haven't gotten into that training mindset of, like, this is right, this is what's happening. You're about to approach with hot dogs. So keep that in mind as well, to have them go back to some of those initial steps and not continue where they left off the day before. Okay. What about generalized guarding? So dogs that start to guard everything. Let's say you have a case where the dog is guarding food, toys, bones, resting spots, a bunch of different things. Triage, what's most important. So assessing what's most manageable. If you can determine what resources you can manage easily, then you're going to have a much easier time if you can control the resources that are easier to manage. So like food balls often are very easy to manage. Let's manage those first and work on some of the other things that may be less easy to manage. Kids' toys, for instance. I might say, okay, we can easily manage the food balls. Your dog's guarding both right now, food ball and toys, but food ball is a little more manageable. So let's work on toys first because your dog's starting to generalize to everything. Also, what can happen with generalized guarders, I was talking about that earlier, was like the movements. So reaching down, tying shoes, reaching towards the dog, walking into a certain area. So this is where our job as good trainers come in again, is we have to really make a good list of what those triggers are, what those antecedents are. If we don't, we're going to miss some things and the client's going to get bitten. And that's or they're going to see an aggressive response, and that's very common for generalized guarders. They're also very difficult to live with. Anybody who's worked with a generalized guarding case, or maybe you even live with one yourself, knows that it's very difficult to manage everything. And so oftentimes I'm less apt to have them try to manage every little detail of their life. I more have them managing the actual antecedent, which is themselves a lot of times, what they're doing, how they're moving around their dog, situational awareness of where the dog is at the time, so that way they can cue the dog to do something else or avoid presenting that trigger in the first place. Here's a fun video or just an interesting video on generalized guarding.
Every night around 9 p.m. my dog picks a random object to guard. Tonight it's a potato.
And what's interesting to me for those kind of cases too, random guarding of objects, is that I definitely find those to be much more operant. So the dog's sort of just going through the motions of, okay, I'm going to get attention or something higher value, or this is what I'm going to keep myself basically occupied with in this time of day. And it becomes very sort of routine. And so definitely going to reach for an operant strategy there. We're going to teach the dog a different routine that's going to pay off with better reinforcers to replace that behavior that they've got going on now. All right. So also the video is going to teach you a lot. As you guys know, I never ask a client to set up the dog to see the resource or any kind of aggressive behavior. I don't need to see the aggressive behavior. And it's obviously risky and to do so. So I don't I don't ask for it. But sometimes clients have video footage like this, security cameras catching things in the home, and the power of video will give you the observation of what potentially is triggering that behavior. So this is not necessarily a resource guarding case, but it shows you. Well, I'll let you guys kind of watch this and see if you can determine what the triggers are here. Trigger warning, there is a child's directed bite that happens in this video. Not a very severe one. There's no severe injuries to this child, but it's just so you're aware.
Come here, bud. Jake, come here. Come here, buddy.
Mama.
do your puzzle real quick.
So if you guys look back, you can see where one child sort of kind of steps on the dog or just catches the dog's paws there. And then what does the dog do? Is like, okay, did you do that? And look kind of staring at this child. Video is going to explain a lot of what's happening. And so one of the client's questions might be like, I don't get why the dog went after this child, right? And, again, dogs kind of picked out the wrong culprit, but it allows you to explain what's happened to the client. Okay, what about poor management scenarios? So getting to some more of these difficult types of cases. So let's say you go into a client's home, and this is going to give you a lot of information, by the way. When you see what the client's living situation is like, sometimes there's tons of stuff lying around, which is going to make it more difficult. It's like a dog that has issues with children and they're living right next to a school and run a home daycare or something like that. It becomes much different from a management perspective. So how do we help those clients? Because you can't say, please go in and clean up everything in your house if they don't necessarily are not necessarily equipped to do so, or they have a reason to have that kind of all those resources leaving around. Maybe they are not capable of actually having a clean space. So we have to be empathetic to that in some situations. So we might ask them to, but it may not be possible. So what might be easier for those clients is to set up an area for the dog to be in that doesn't have the likelihood for those resources to be presented. So a small area of the home or an area of the home where, call it the Zen den, where the dog can go and the client and people can interact with the dog without the presence of those resources. That's not to say we're going to put the dog in a small X pen area and leave them there all day. It's just for when the client's not able to manage things or maybe needs a little help with the day-to-day routine. And that's what I'm talking about, routine. It's like create that routine and give them a schedule, because if you find a messy home, that sometimes means messy scheduling. So we want to help them out as much as we can. So creating that routine for them, where some clients may be able to easily do that for themselves, may not be so easy in some cases. You may choose to use a muzzle in these cases. So let's say it's a dog picking up socks and shoes and everything like that. You might choose to acclimate the dog to a muzzle, so that way when it's around these big environments where there's tons of resources, they're not able to physically pick up that object. Ancillary options can be like, okay, if the dog's generalized guarding and really giving you a hard time, you might say, okay, let's get this dog some days into somebody else's house or a relative or friends or dog daycare, just to alleviate some of that stress for both the dog and the client. And in some cases, you do have to discuss the overall prognosis. Is this the right environment for your dog? Because obviously it's going to be one that's very difficult to prevent inadvertent reinforcement of resource guarding behaviors. And so you might have to have a prognosis discussion with some of these clients. A couple other quick tips for your food bowl gardens. Again, if you're getting into more of the advanced concepts here, if you've got a dog that guards their food bowl, a lot of them, they're going to inhale that food very quickly. So they go over the food bowl and and it's gone within 3 seconds, and you have 3 seconds to work with the dog. That doesn't give us a lot of time for training. So slow feeder balls can work well. And if you've got raw feeders or dogs that you're working with and you're using something that's messy as the reinforcer, paper plates or even plates, you just put it on there and you kind of slide it over to the dog, so you're not like throwing wet dog food on carpet or anything like that. Side note on frustration, though. Sometimes dogs that are really voraciously hungry or trying to get to their resource, and we make it more difficult for them, and they don't know how to get the food out of that, it can add frustration, which can be a fuel for their resource guarding behavior. So just be aware of your slow feeder bowls and things like that. Make sure the dog is not getting frustrated by that actual particular item. All right, so let's get into some videos of behavior change now. So this is Ollie. This is more of an operant strategy. This dog had a long-standing history of guarding his food bowl as well as toys. So we're working on just using his name as a cue to kind of look up out of the food bowl or even approach the owner. And so that's what this video is displaying, is more of an operant strategy. We're looking for a cued behavior. And again, the reason why is because of the long-standing sort of practice of this guarding behavior.
Ollie. Good. Excellent. Good.
He's used to getting videotaped.
Good. So even if you don't ask for it and he does it, still reward. Yeah, you can try it.
Ollie. Good boy.
You still have some more or no?
No, that was the last one.
Couple more.
Ollie.
So the reason why we do that is twofold. Is that the client can cue the dog when they're walking through a certain area while the dog's eating, or maybe has a food puzzle toy or something like that, and the dog's going to learn this new behavior that's going to be reinforced. But you also, of course, get the classical conditioning benefits, where the dog knows that when you come into the room and say "Ollie" or approach, a good thing's going to happen. So that's an operant strategy for this type of behavior. Here's the classical conditioning strategy. So this is producing high value reinforcers without any contingency for behavior. So the dog doesn't have to be doing anything in particular. The dog could be growling, lunging, barking, snarling, snapping, and trying to bite. And we can still get the classical conditioning effects. We obviously don't want to set them up to do that because it's stressful for the animal, and there's some inadvertent potential for reinforcing operant behavior. But most of the time, you're going to be just fine, just like you saw the trainer in Mexico throwing treats at the German Shepherd while the dog's barking, lunging at him, because the amount of distance you can get is you can only get so far with that situation. So in this case, you'll see Riley kind of look up and snarl in one part of the video, but you'll see the progress just in this video alone of a short session. But you see this, you'll see the setup as well. Back tie. And additional side note here, if you're working on a floor like this, a slip-proof mat under the food bowl, because the last thing we want to do is see this food bowl kind of start to slide in any particular direction or just out of reach and frustrate the dog. So that'll prevent that sliding. So you'll notice at the end there too the strategy to get Riley to move away from the food bowl, and that's important to again coach your clients on. So that was one of our very initial training sessions, just to give you an idea of where we started. And off camera, what you can't see is the owner when they're tossing treats, they're just kind of approaching, and behind the camera is like a sort of breakfast bar as well. So just kind of walking back and forth on that parallel. And if the dog doesn't necessarily have to notice you at first, you're just tossing treats. They'll notice the treats, and then they'll start to kind of like, as you saw, look for what the owner's doing next. All right, so this is a little update video with Riley, so you can see some of the changes that have occurred with the client's progress. This is a video the client sent me.
Good girl, Riley. Good girl, bro. Good girl.
All right, and also this dog had issues guarding paper towels. So this is teaching some of that voluntary leave it I was talking about. To teach that, though, in the initial stages, you want to make sure the dog obviously can't get to the object. So usually what I do is set up an X pen or baby gate so the dog physically can't get to the resource that we're using, that we want them to actually leave. So if it's socks or eyeglasses, again, in this case, paper towels, I start out with just dropping the paper towels and mark and reinforce for the dog voluntarily disengaging. So looking away from the object or looking at you after they looked at the paper towel. So I'm just showing the owner how to do that here. Try to see how she does here. Good girl. Good job. Good girl. Good job. So, depending on the severity of that, you might have to take shorter steps or definitely easier steps for the dog. But once they start to grasp the concept, if I just look at this thing and not actually touch it or try to eat it, it'll pay off much better for me. Good. So she looked at it, looked back. That's what I'm looking for. So she's voluntarily leaving it alone. Yeah. But if she gets it, it's not the end of the world. I'll take either of those. She can bring it to me, drop it, or she can just look at it and leave it alone, and that's what'll pay off for her. Yeah. Good girl. So she look at it again, and then she looks away. That's the behavior she's doing. I don't know. I didn't ask her to do it. No. That's important. You don't want to always have to say leave it, drop it, all that stuff. So.
Right. Just do it. Oh my God.
Good girl. Good job. And I'm just tossing the treats that way for two things, in case I have to pick up the paper towel, or if I want to just reset her so she comes back and does the same. Good. It was quick glance that time. Just bring the treat back. Okay, what's over there? What's over there? Good girl. Pippa's got a great question too about using other activities before I start counter conditioning sessions. Typically, no, and the reason why is I don't want to pair things in the wrong order. So if the dog's got a sort of a threshold moment type resource guarding sessions, which we can argue can happen in your first few sessions, meaning the dog's still a little bit stressed, which can happen with any aggression case. About the context in which it's happening. We don't want that particular training or play session to start to predict this icky event. Most of the time you're going to be okay, but I find that you run some risk, a little risk of that. So I tend to just jump right into the counter conditioning session. Okay, let's look at one other case here. This is Lily, similar type of resource guarding behavior as you saw with Riley. This is another trainer. She sent me some videos of her working with this client. And you can see the X pen set up here. So obviously if this door is closed, the dog's, as long as they can't jump over, is physically contained as you're working on this. And so the client can stay safe. This is further on in the stages of their training. Now, if you guys look back here too, you can see the dog still subtly freezes. And so you want to, that's the beauty of video and seeing the sessions here. There's just a brief freeze, but that's okay for right now because this is just one of the initial sessions. So you might still see some mixed signals, but as long as you're seeing a decrease in that frequency of freezing or you're seeing more increase in frequency of these kind of behaviors, just like, oh, that's right, you have something for me, you know you're heading in the right direction. So I wouldn't necessarily always have to adjust and say, oh, you need more distance or you need a higher value reinforcer. Remember, there's fluidity to resource guarding cases depending at, for instance, what point of the food bowl the dog is halfway done, mostly done, or they just started. So keep that in mind.
Get exciting.
Hey, Lily, what are you doing? Hey, you.
Lily.
Where are you?
So you can see as a perfect example of the dog not responding to something it would have responded to earlier, and it's because the food ball was just put down. So you'll see, I'm just going to scroll ahead in the video, the dog
In
does
there, just
get
for
a little
being
better.
present. Don't go closer. Yep, just kind of stay where you are.
Here. Oh, yes. No click.
And in those cases, just continue with the classical strategy where you just drop treats and walk away. It doesn't matter if the dog looks at the owner or anything like that at that point. You still want to employ classical conditioning. Good question from Damask is that could the dog get frustrated being asked to come away from their meal frequently? The goal is to be definitely no. It can happen in some rare cases, but typically, as long as you're producing that higher value reinforcer, you're actually headed in the right direction because the dog is actually leaving the resource. Because most of the time, they're not even going to think about leaving the resource. So when they do, it's an indication for me that they're actually saying, okay, this is actually cool, because you see a higher frequency of that leaving the food ball behavior. So we know we're headed in the right direction. So it's generally not frustration related, or we don't run that risk as much as, let's say, the dog having a difficult time getting to their resources in the first place. Because they, in a sense, they know, like, and I'm using air quotes, they know they're going to get to go back to their same resource.
Yes, good girl. Good girl.
So I'm just going to speed through these videos in the interest of time, but you're going to see, again, the development here. Now they're getting closer.
Hello. Oh, good girl. Good girl. Hi, Lily. Good girl. Yeah, good job.
Are you getting her a piece of kibble? Just the one that I'm seeing you throw?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Okay. I wasn't sure.
There
Oh,
you go.
hey, Lily. Good girl. What a good girl. Yes, a good girl. That's a big cookie.
Yeah.
Oh, my. That's a giant cookie.
So you can see again the development of, you're seeing faster response to her name being called. You're seeing the change in body language, much looser, softer body language. There's no freezing in that video. So that's when you know you're making progress, and you're also decreasing distance. So kind of gives you an indication of the progress you're looking for when you're moving stage to stage. This case, if I recall, was about a couple months of total sessions, maybe 3-4 sessions with the trainer, and then the client working with, of course, Lily on maybe every other day or so in terms of frequency. Okay, let's talk about dog-to-dog resource guarding, and probably go for about the next 7-8 minutes on this. And so just want to give you a heads up on the time. I will get to all the Q&A after, but just so you guys are aware of where the session is. All right, so dog-to-dog resource guarding. Obviously, it's the management aspect. The difference is here is when the managing multi-dog homes, as many of you know, is much more difficult than dog-to-human resource guarding. So let's talk about that. What I've done over the years is determine that some clients are able to handle elementary school level resource guarding cases, meaning they're not going to grasp or even carry out the concepts of counter conditioning or differential reinforcement strategies. So sometimes I go into cases where it's all management. It's the dogs are fighting over bully sticks or something like that, and I go in and start to talk about management. And that's sometimes enough to work with that case. We just manage the bully sticks. Some clients are happily saying, "Oh, so I just feed them in separate rooms. Oh, I can do that," and then problem solved. But sometimes, of course, we're going to go in with a more robust behavior change strategy that might include the management as well as the counter conditioning we've seen, like we just saw in the last video. So, pairing positive associations with approaches of the other dog. And then you might do differential reinforcement strategies with the handler present. So let's say it's a dog that guards their owner from the other dog in the home. That owner is going to, of course, be there because they're the resource, but they're going to be there to direct traffic, so to speak. So they can cue the other dog, they can cue the dog they're with to do those alternative behaviors. DRA, by the way, stands for differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, which simply translates to what do you want the dog to do instead? So when the other dog approaches, stay put or just look at me instead of jumping off the couch and attacking them. So the DRA there is the alternative behavior, is maybe looking at the owner instead of chasing after the other dog. And then the college level, some clients, a lot of trainers, hobby trainers, people that are into dog behavior can start to work on differential reinforcement with autonomy, meaning the dog doesn't have to be cued or managed. They can go into the other room and see the other dog with a bone and be like, "Oh, okay, I know what to do here. I'm going to go check in with my owner because the other dog's got a bone." So the environmental cue is the other dog with the resource to go do this new behavior. Go to your mat, go to your check in with your owner. All these behaviors can be done with environmental cues. There's one other safety aspect, though, when you're working with dog-to-dog resource guarding, if the human is the resource, is make sure your clients understand this 4 hours of separation rule, where dog A and dog B, let's say you've got two dogs, you want, whether the person's on the couch or coming home from work or delivering treats or feeding the dogs or about to let the dogs outside, anything that's a resource, you want the human in the middle so they can intervene, but they are also not presenting the resource to the dogs at 12 and 12:01 on the clock. All right. Very simple concept, but important one for the clients to understand. So let's jump into that high school level of dog to dog resource guarding I was just talking about. So we're going to manage the resources, of course, but when we include them, so let's say it's dogs fighting over the owner's attention when he gets home, they get home from work or something like that. We want to identify those hot spots. So locations in which resources might happen, such as the front door when the owner gets home from work. What's similar to that? Make sure you coach the clients or you identify where in the home is similar to that. Front door. What about the back door, where the sliding door is, where they go out to the deck or to the patio? Very similar place, so we want to make sure we're managing that well. Owner's bed, maybe the kid's bedroom, their bed is also very similar, and it's a hot spot for a potential conflict. So manage those. And then we teach an alternative behavior. So let's say it's, again, the owner's coming home from work. We go back to that other slide, right? And here's the human coming home from work. Dog A learns to station on one side, dog B learns to station on the other, and they get reinforced for that desirable stationing behavior, but it keeps everybody safe. So that's the differential reinforcement strategy. And we're going to add in counter conditioning. That's when similar to a dog eating out of their food bowl, the human's approaching, we're going to do the same thing, but the other dog's approaching. And of course, you want to do your setups where you have an additional helper or creative treat tossing of how you get that dog to come towards you and move away with your safety setups, of course. So whether it's tethering, X pens, baby gates, all of the things I talked about. So let's watch that in action. Here's a high school level type of approach for dog to dog guarding and competition over resources. These two dogs fought over the mom's attention. So mom lives upstairs, the client lives downstairs, and they fought right in this spot, this doorway here, and a couple of fights. So that's the hot spot. That's the context in which it happens. The resource is the mom. So what do we want these dogs to do instead? So that differential reinforcement before they go to see the mom. So a very basic plan would be stationing. You guys need to station before you go upstairs. So one dog at 10 o'clock in relation to the client, and one at 2 o'clock, and one dog goes up at a time. Begin with her. get her to sit. He can hang back here, and that's fine.
Stop.
And you're gonna go up, and she should keep going up and not. Yep, see what she's trying to do. So keep going up.
Go up.
Good, and then you can let him up. Just to the halfway landing, and then we'll pull him back down. All right, Wilson, come on.
Come on.
So many dog-to-dog resource guarding cases, it's all about teaching the dogs what to do instead in that context. So remember that contextual locations are very important to work with the dog, so they learn this new behavior pattern in that context. Because the vast majority of the dog fights that happen in homes are over resources, and they're often in the same location or in the same context. Once you identify those contexts and work on them in those locations, you're going to fix a majority of the issues because you're taking care of the environment. Okay, so now what about dog-to-dog resource guiding? When we want to teach the dogs, okay, when you see another dog with a bone, you're going to walk away. Not the easiest thing to teach a lot of clients. They've got to be somewhat savvy about training, but I do find some clients are able to grasp this concept. So let me show you what that looks like. This is actually my little dog, Izzy, formerly lived with me, now lives with my ex-wife, but she was terrible resource guarding, dog-to-dog resource guarding. In fact, the first day we brought her home at 12 weeks of age, the first thing she did was charge over to my lab and latched onto her ear, wouldn't let go as a 12-week-old puppy. So we worked on her with the resource guarding issues, but I taught my lab, when Izzy's got a resource, I want you to just move away or station. So Izzy's going to feel better about that, and it keeps the conflicts away. So you can, of course, work on Izzy's guarding, but I wanted to show you what to do with the other dog. So obviously, you teach to teach this. You have to teach the dog Crystal to station first, without the other dog around. Then you have to teach the cue, go to your station. And then you have to transfer that cue to when you see Izzy get a resource, go to your station. And then finally, you transfer it to when Izzy's got a resource in any location, go to your station, and that'll pay off for you. So here's one more example of it. And it doesn't always have to be a station. You might teach the dog to go check in with their owner. So, or check in with really any human that's in the home rather than going towards the dog, sort of like as reporting to everybody, hey, Izzy's got a resource. Now, what do you got for me? So she's learning, okay, if Izzy's got a resource, they go check in with somebody or station. So this can, of course, start to generalize. So this dog is another dog-to-dog resource guarding case, competition over owners or strangers' attention. So people's attention was one of the major resources that this dog actually severely injured the other dog. You'll see Maya, this brown dog in the home. And the owners practiced with teaching her to go to a station every time the dog got attention from somebody. So you'll see that the environmental cue is attention from somebody for this dog to go station. So this is a cold trial, meaning we're not warming up the dogs. We're not using any other reinforcers for the moment. We're just seeing if this dog responds to those environmental cues. And you'll see this dog, Kismet, makes some wonderful decisions here. 3 times in this video, she goes and decides to try different stations when the other dog gets a resource. Good girl. Good girl. Hi.
Good.
See you. Good girl. So we'll just let them be for a little bit here. I just want to see, kind of get their natural, especially when there's something in the environment that they might find of value, like treat guy, and how resources play a role. All right. So she's like, all right, let me try this station. And then she goes to this station. Let me try this one. And then she goes and finds another station. So you know the client's doing a great job when you're starting to see the behavior generalize so well like that. All right, so that wraps up the resource guarding session, and I'll jump into Q&A. There's my contact info if anybody wants to reach out or see any of the other resources on aggression.